Welcome to another episode of Talk Time with MaxContact. I'm your host, Sean McIver. In this episode, we're joined by Dave Clowes, the contact center manager for Shared Business Services, the NHS. Dave's coming up on 13 years in the contact center industry and once grew a team index by 27 in just 1 year while saving close to 170,000. Welcome, Dave. That's a bit of a very short introduction. I always like to hand over to our guest for their own introduction. What would you add?
Yeah, so I think being in the contact center industry is an interesting description. I think for me, I fell in love with it 13 years ago. I'd previously worked in a retail banking environment, kind of took a job on a whim really. So I took a team leader job working for a general insurance company. And I just fell in love with the uniqueness of the industry, the ability to have such an effect on people's careers, the work that you're able to do, the structure. There's just so many aspects of it that have just really resonated with me. And sort of over the last 13 years have been able to help me develop myself and numerous other people. So yeah, I think being in the industry is one description, but definitely falling in love with it is probably a more accurate description.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I agree. I'm going to say, as part of my research, I saw in your bio, I'm Dave, I'm obsessed with engagement and cups of tea. So, two questions. How do you like your tea? And what do you define as being good engagement?
So yeah, a white tea, obviously milk in last because I'm not a heathen, but engagement for me is being realistic. I think what I mean by that is spending time with people to understand the realism of the situation. I think we'll obviously get into more of this throughout the conversation, but a big thing for me is understanding where we're at with the world and that the people that typically will take into the contact center now have very different behavioral traits to those maybe 10, 15 years ago when I started my management career. And understanding how to manifest the best outcomes from them is particularly important. And I think when you get that right with people, then your engagement will be particularly profitable for the industry that you're working for.
Yeah, absolutely. We've all been there. Employee engagement day happens, donuts are bought, funsies are had, job done, right?
No, not
Oh,
for me.
what do you mean? What's missing?
No, I think from my perspective, and I've been fortunate enough to work in two areas that were fairly depleted in terms of engagement. And often they've been in organizations with really, really great benefits packages and all of the great stuff that you said. And that was present. And there was still an issue of engagement. For me, I think the fundamentals really come down to the people and having that interest in people and really understanding what they're about. I remember listening to a podcast a couple of years ago with a guy called Martin Teasdale, who's a contact center guru. I think everyone knows him anyway. And it was a really, really great podcast. And one of the big things that's influenced my leadership style and how I approach engagement over the last couple of years was him literally saying I would block out time in my diary and wander out into the call center and often cause the resource planners problems by going and having chat with people and getting to know them and what drives them and just what's going on in their life. And I think that's often when I look at teams that are struggling for engagement is the big thing that's missing is hierarchy stunting the ability for people to have really normal conversations. And thank yous, I think, is a massive thing as well. People being thanked in a really sincere manner for their work and it coming from all levels is really important for engagement. So yeah, whilst donuts do help, I think you have to get the fundamentals right first and foremost.
I think it's one of the things I've seen previously in my career, certainly over a history of working in a range of different contact centers. I would agree with you in that I've seen it done well, and I've also seen it done badly. I've seen it where actually the hierarchy is quite flat and people are free to talk to higher levels, even if they're just an agent on the phone. I've also seen it done really negatively, whereby there is a very much a them and us. And the further up the hierarchy you go, the more distant they are in logistically and psychologically from those agents who are actually dealing with those customers and those calls. And I think that's very much something that I've seen done well and done poorly. What can you do if you do identify that you are lacking in that element from an engagement point of view? I know that there's not going to be a silver bullet, but are there core principles or is there something foundational that anyone can do to improve?
I think if you've got that inherent problem, the first thing that I would potentially advise anyone to address is the logistics of where you're sat. And I know that we sit in a remote world a big part of the time, but there is obviously in most organisations some element of office work. And I think the first and foremost thing would be where are your leadership sat? Are you sat behind a closed door? Are you sat on a pod away from everyone? Or are you sat amongst your team? And whilst I appreciate there are elements of work where you absolutely need quiet and you need to be away from the hustle bustle, etc. Broadly speaking, for a portion of your time, you should be sat with your team, and that comes from all levels throughout the contact center. I think that's point one that I would always advise. Point two for me is I spoke about the power of thank you just a second ago. I think it's the placement of it as well. You know, I've worked for some really, really great organizations with some really great leaders, and I've also worked for some organizations with some leaders who weren't so great. And I'll use that diplomatically. I think the biggest thing that I've seen is sometimes a thank you can be slapped on the back of a week where behaviors throughout the week from the leadership team weren't in line with the values of the organization. And I guess it comes down to authenticity and people being authentic throughout the week. I think that's also a big piece. You know, if contact center manager A comes and sits next to you and tries to be your mate and they've never done it before and that's it and it's not authentic, it has to come from the heart without being too cheesy. It's got to be real. It's got to be authentic.
I think that's a key element. That authenticity that you've just mentioned is absolutely crucial. It can come across so easily as disingenuous. I've seen scenarios where, you know, someone who is, you know, reputedly and has a reputation for being quite cool and standoffish, not that there's anything wrong with that. They suddenly come over and, you know, it's all best buds, and immediately there's a lot of side eye that goes on. There's suspicion that happens there. You're just like, oh, what do you want? And even if it is meant in a genuine way, because it's so aberrant in behavior, it can result in that oddity, as I say, that side eye, that kind of what is it you're after?
Yeah, I would fundamentally agree with that. And I think for people to buy it, and everyone's got different personalities. People are introverts, extroverts, whatever, but people need to be able to see you show your weakness, show your side where you're able to have a bit of fun poked at you as well. Like if we're getting down to the nuts and bolts of it, my team know that I'm a bit of an extrovert. I can be a bit of a clown at sometimes. And actually that means that they can make fun of me occasionally. And I think that sort of stuff helps as well.
I think you absolutely need to have a human element of it. You know, it can't be an autocratic, authoritarian, you know, and the top says, the bottom does. I think yeah, certainly for me, that's not going to, I'm not going to say it's not possible because I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think it makes it much harder to do engagement in that sense. I'm going to circle back. You mentioned logistics. I think with hybrid working basically here to stay in some way, shape, or form, that does introduce an additional set of challenges inherently in terms of engagement because we are then isolated. You've got call takers who are dealing with customers from their kitchen table. How do you manage a hybrid contact center team? How do you address those really key challenges? And what are some of those big challenges that you've seen?
I think in one of the centres I've worked in, I have quite a unique one where we are a multi-site operation and we have a proportion of the site in one area of the country and such a smaller proportion in the other site of the country. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges is actually the bigger proportion spend time together regularly, whereas the smaller proportion don't get to see that. And for me, that has been a really, really difficult challenge, and we're still working through that. But I think key things to that are listening to them, having open forums, understanding how they're feeling, how we can better involve them and stuff, trying to make use of a variety of tools. So whilst we will always hold face-to-face meetings, we will make sure that we're having like an inclusive remote forum as well. I think making sure that they know they're still there is as such and taking time out from various positions in the leadership team just to check in on them. That's definitely the biggest challenge that I've faced. I think general remote work and I think you can have fun with it. I think it's an opportunity to do things differently. We've done stuff like where we have like 20 minutes of fun within the contact center at the moment, where we schedule 20 minutes in, there's no business talk, and the team leaders are tasked with every month go and find something fun to do with the team. And it's brought some really, really amazing things that have come out. We've done scavenger hunts, we've done the really bland stuff to start off with, like the two truths and two lies. And there's been loads and loads of examples where team leaders and the team have thought differently about what they can do for their 20 minutes of fun. And it's made a real impact and it's helped the first problem that I alluded to with the separation in the country. So I actually think that 2020, when this world really started, and I just thought actually this is going to be fun. Like there's stuff that we can do, and we're not so much at that place now. But even during COVID, things like bingo and all of the stuff that you could do in the office can absolutely be translated into a remote working world.
Think that's a really good point. I love the fact that in spite of the chaos that happened in those years, I love the fact that you were still able to see that and perceive that to be an opportunity. I think that speaks volumes to your mindset and your outlook on these challenging circumstances. I really appreciate the fact that you actually perceive it as an opportunity. And I wonder how many others out there have got challenges at the moment that maybe with a slight shift in their view would be able to say, okay, actually, here's an opportunity to do something in a different way.
The other thing you need to consider as well is, and I never get these groups right, but I broadly know what they are. But you've got your gen categories, and actually from a remote working world, I think one of the things that we don't recognize is for a lot of the new workforce coming in 18, 19, 20, actually speaking through a text-based system like Teams or whatever is very replicant to how they live their daily lives. So a lot of 18, 19, 20-year-olds' life is social media, and they will converse through WhatsApp, Snapchat, all of that. I'm sounding really old now, but you get the picture. And I think a lot of people would do really well to recognize that that's an opportunity for contact centers because it's very similar to how they conduct themselves in their normal world, which isn't reminiscent of the typical office environment before COVID.
I think it also speaks, I'm going to speak kind of slightly as an aside here, because it's something I've found is that I think certainly for people of a particular disposition or of a particular age, I count myself in that category. I went through a learning period whereby I thought of particularly Teams messages, I thought of them as being a voice conversation in terms of if someone is asking me for something, I need to respond instantly that second. And actually, that's not always the case. And so there had to be a bit of a reset for me. And I think you're right in that for other people who are used to that type of communication format as a default and have grown up with that communication format, they don't have those same challenges. And I think that's a really interesting point. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and one that, being completely honest, I hadn't thought of.
Yeah, it's something that I've stewed on recently because like yourself, I do have that tendency to try and go back to people straight away. It's just inherently built in me. But yeah, I do think a lot of contact centers, and there are a lot out there doing really, really good work with different technology and gamification and stuff like that. But there's a real opportunity with the new breed of contact center agent that will be coming through the ranks.
Speaking of this new type of contact center agent, not only a new generation of contact center agents, but also a new generation of ways of working. As I say, the hybrid remote work in whatever format that has taken. We know that within the greater, wider, broader contact center industry, that the key challenges are around retaining agents, training agents, and around recruiting agents. And part of that is around keeping agents motivated. So keeping them invested is obviously crucial in today's contact center landscape. Have you got any specific strategies have you found that have been particularly effective in boosting team engagement through that lens?
Yes, and I guess part of my approach sort of is counter to some of the points you've raised, if I'm perfectly honest. So the way I view it, depending on generation, ambition, goals, etc., is I spoke a bit about realism before. There is an element of realism. Actually, if you have a 19, 20-year-old aspiring agent come into you, you've probably got them for 18 months to 2 years. And ultimately, within that capacity, there might be other capacity within the contact center. But I do think a larger part is ensuring that you are really getting in the hearts and minds of people and understanding what they want from their career and having those really honest conversations from day one. When somebody comes into the business, I mean, you have to be realistic with it. People need to be able to understand the fundamentals of their roles, but often very quickly people have an idea of what they want to do and where they want to go. And I think it's really important that you do drip feed that through their development and you keep that alive for them because that's where you get your best results from people. If you're willing to walk through walls for people, they'll tend to walk through walls for yourself as well.
And from the other type of agent, or from the other side of users in the context of the users who are there for the longer term career, are there different strategies in terms of motivating them and ensuring that they're engaged? Because presumably it's more easy to become jaded over time.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's frustrated me throughout my career is hearing they're just happy to do their job. And I hate that term. I think for me, regardless of individual personality, tenure, whatever, there's always something in somebody's role or separate to their role that can provide them with a better spark. And it can really range, it could be supporting another area of business during availability time. It could be doing the parking rate, or it could be organising the Christmas party. It's around understanding that individual and what's important to them and trying to find something that they can be really passionate about aside to their work, something that's going to keep their interest and actually think, oh, this person's investing in me and they're valuing me.
Yeah, the thing for me is personalizing it. It's understanding that people are individuals and that they have their own individual motivations. Not only that, but that those motivations can change over time. What motivated me 10 years ago is not the same thing that motivates me today. I can promise you that. And I think that that's true on a much shorter time scale within any given role. And I think having a mindfulness of that and having an awareness of that. So to the team leaders who are listening, how aware are you of the people within your teams, of in fact, to everybody who's listening, within your individual team, how aware are you of what the motivators and goals are for those people that you work with and for? And I think that's a really good question to ask ourselves, because I think if you don't know what that is, how can you then effectively engage? Is that a fair assessment, would you say?
Yeah, I think going back to the jaded piece that you sort of raised, somebody can very much become desensitized to what they're doing. Like they'll have done it for a long period of time, and they'll think they want one thing, but you can use questions and get to the root cause of it. I've had many an example where I've had somebody who is just here to do their job, quote marks, and we've got to the bottom of it, and actually there is something different or deep down that they would like to explore, but they're frightened of change. They're not comfortable with change, and they've got comfort of what they're doing. I think whilst it can be really challenging during busier periods, and obviously there is a natural element of stress to contact centre work, there is a certain level of comfort to it as well, in terms of you've got your breaks protected, you know exactly what you're doing, etc. And actually coming out of that can sometimes be a bit of an adjustment period for individuals.
Yeah, I think there's a secondary piece to this as well, and that's I think when we think about the metrics for contact centers, obviously you've got your success metrics and the KPIs that drive those outcomes. And I think when we think about engagement and even agent happiness, I think one of the things that we think of is that's much softer, that's much more abstract, that doesn't actually tie into or feed directly into those business metrics that we're looking for. And what I've seen previously in some areas is that when you're trying to balance agent happiness with achieving targets, that can be tricky. How do you approach performance management in your contact center to ensure that not only you're getting individual and team success, but you're not disengaging your team in the process?
There's always a place for challenging underperformance, and it needs to be done. However, I am the firm believer as nobody comes to work to do a bad job. It's kind of a saying that one of my old area managers when I worked for NatWest Bank years and years ago coined with me, and it stuck with me. Nobody does come in to do a bad job, and actually, if there is something not quite right there, there's an underlying reason for it. So yes, we'll use PIPs, we'll use etc. But I think always stage one is trying to get to underneath the reason for any underperformance. And it could be a whole range of reasons. It could be that the role just isn't right for them. And actually that honest conversation needs to happen. And actually as a leader, my job then would be to look, we've had this honest conversation, you've been really honest with me, and I really want to help you find something that is gonna fuel your passion, or try and find you somewhere where you're gonna feel more comfortable in terms of employment. But also from a standpoint, there could be ulterior motives, like mental health is obviously a big problem within contact centers, and actually trying to understand that and how you can avoid trigger points for people, and actually how you can manage them in a different way to get a more pleasing experience for them, but also better performance. Yeah, I just think there's a whole host of stuff that you can do with performance management that can alleviate a lot of the formal routes. I think the other thing that I'm really passionate about is most businesses that I've been in, when you go in and you start talking about performance management processes, it's stigmatized through the way it's been managed, and often it's this is a stick and I'm going to hit you with that stick because you're not performing. Whereas I think the performance management process really does need to be framed properly. And it needs to be a side-by-side project of actually, I can see that you're not performing in this area. And what I'd really like to do is have a really structured plan around how we can deal with this over a period of time. And what we're going to do is we're going to have regular touch points. We're going to have a really structured approach to getting you back to where you need to be. I'm not going to expect you to be there in week one, and just being really pragmatic around that approach. I think for me, that's one of the biggest things is yeah, performance management can be sometimes stigmatized and not used in the way it's intended.
I remember you've reminded me, actually, I've seen this done in a couple of different ways myself, and it's reminded me of one. And there was a place that I worked for many years ago, and it was one of the sorts of places whereby if you weren't performing, you want a performance improvement plan. And it was this doom and gloom, oh, I better start looking for another job, and that's that time. And then they actually changed it up and they said, well, actually, nobody's perfect. Everyone's performance can be improved. So we're actually going to put everybody on a performance improvement plan. And they were able to take the stigma away from it. And that way, everybody had a focus area. And it meant people were actually more forthright in talking about it among themselves and going, oh, I'm, trying to improve this area of my performance plan because this is the area that I'm weakest at. Oh, I actually find this really works well for me. I'm struggling here. Then it fosters much more positive communication in that context. And again, you've just triggered that, reminding me of that and the difference it made. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't overnight. There was a period of time where everyone in the business was like, are we all good? Are we all being let go? But when we got there, it was a really positive outcome.
Yeah, and for me that sounds like the ideal culture, and obviously a lot of elbow work and all of that jazz has to go into to get into that place. But that is absolutely where you want to be. Like everyone should be really, really clear on where they are against their performance. I think the other thing I've seen in other organizations that I've worked in is sometimes around like gradings and the year and mid-year gradings, like that conversation should probably be very, very clear throughout the year, so people are clear on where their annual appraisal is going to be. If you're going to be at the lower end, you should really, really be clear on that by the end of the year. It should be no surprises to you. If you're doing really, really well, there should be no doubt that you're going to be getting a higher grade. You should have been praised to the hilts, etc. And I think all of that sort of stuff kind of ties in. And actually, I really love that idea of having everyone on a development plan. That's definitely something for me to have a ponder in my own organization.
Yeah, it's something that I haven't seen done in many places, but when I've seen it, and there's been two places, and they've done it, and they've done it well, where everybody's been on a development plan because nobody's perfect, and that's been the principle. Even up to like the CEO. The CEO has a development plan. Don't get me wrong, the content of it isn't shared, but the CEO has a development plan and is quite happy to talk about elements of it within the remit of what they can talk about. I guess that feeds into another piece, which is as businesses and as people who work for businesses that are inevitably measured against successes, engagement has always felt like one of those intangible, nebulous metrics that's very hard to actually measure. What metrics do you think are important to track in this sense? How can they feed into wider contact center performance measures?
So for us, well, for me, the biggest one is like your index score, and that's going to give you a really, really great idea of where you're at. I think for me, you can be really comfortable going into those scorings. If you know you've done the right things, you could be comfortable in knowing where your score's going to be. You shared an example earlier where there was a significant rise in one of the organizations I've worked in. I wasn't sure that it was going to be quite that, but I was very, very confident that it was going to be that. And the reason that I was confident with that is because we were able to do lots of work within our team around performance metrics, and being really transparent around performance metrics and being really clear around them. And actually, I remember having a conversation with an agent, and they're a really, really hard-working agent, and they were very much of the view that I'm working so hard, but X person isn't. And this is very early on in the organization I was working in. My assurance to that person was, I'm not going to get into individual conversations about people, but you need to understand that moving forward, we're going to have really clear guidance around our performance metrics. And unfortunately, if somebody's not going to adhere to them, then there will be a way of obviously dealing with that. And I think through seeing that and helping people who weren't necessarily invested in the centre and invested in what we were doing, either find alternative employment or take them through that performance management process, which obviously led them to either performing or moving elsewhere, has helped the transparency within the team. That was a big impact in that organization of how we improved engagement, was having everyone sort of on the level playing field, having that vision, having that really clear guidance of the direction that we were going in. And then hand in hand, obviously, if you've got really, really great performance indicators, ultimately your service is going to be better. Yes, there's going to be peaks and troughs, but broadly speaking, they're going to be less busy. They're going to have more time to support other areas of the business. They're going to have more time for their development. So I think it all sort of ties in. Hopefully that's answered your question.
It really has. And I think it's answered it in a really holistic way. You've touched on a whole range of different things that can all be used as contributing measures of the engagement aspect of it. And in fact, they do tie across to the overall performance. I mean, in principle, if we say simple sentences like a disengaged workforce will result in reduction in performance, everyone can conceptually understand that. But I think it's actually grounding that in reality and getting those connections in and being able to directly correlate the two in a meaningful way that takes it out of the abstract and into the realistic. And I think that that's something that a lot of people struggle with. I struggled with it for a long period of time. You know, abstractly, I can get behind that. Richard Branson famously talks about, look after your staff and they'll look after your customers. But it's very hard, I think, for a lot of people to then translate that to the day-to-day business environment and the targets and the bringing that into the BAU, if you like, I think is a real challenge.
Yeah. And that Richard Branson quote is something that's really, really stuck with me through my career. I think people are everything. And I see a lot of places say that, and the words are just the words. Whereas I think if you actually live and breathe that, like we touched on it earlier, authenticity is a massive, massive thing. If people can see that you really mean that and you really are about the people, it does make a world of difference. And if you're serving people, I read a lot about service, like a lot of Simon Sinek stuff about service and being of service to people. I think if you can shift your mentality as a leader, team leader, or manager in a contact center to be somebody of service, that will make a real difference to your contact center and how you're viewed and how your operation functions. I think that's a really, really important topic, actually.
Yeah, I agree. I'm going to switch it up just slightly as we start drawing this conversation to a tail. But I think it's an important conversation, and I've asked a lot of people about this over the last few months. It's 2024. We can't get through a conversation about the contact center landscape without talking about AI and artificial intelligence and automation and everything that that brings with it. Between leveraging technology to getting agents having the knowledge they need to effectively support customers, combined with AI on the rise in contact centers, how do you balance that benefit with the nervousness that that naturally engenders, the trust issues that can arise from anything that is new and change, especially in light of AI and the potential for hallucinations? And just thinking about that in terms of the shifting in technology, maybe even coupled with that hybrid remote work that we talked about earlier on, how do we balance and identify the opportunities against identifying the challenges that leaders need to be mindful of when we think about implementing technology change, in particular AI? What's your take there?
So I've been reading a lot about this recently, and the biggest thing that kind of sticks out for me as a point that needs to be further considered is there's a lot of concepts and a lot of practical stuff in the background that's going on. But what I'm not reading, well, reading very minimal of, is the actual impact to the customer and what the customer thinks. And that is a big thing that needs to be understood in these open conversations around how people are feeling around the service that they're being provided from AI options. I think from a tool perspective, I think there's a lot of good stuff that you can promote with your teams. Things like the knowledge articles that are populated when you're talking on calls, that sort of genie extract type place that a lot of contact centers are going. I think actually if you can glorify the benefits in terms of the speed and service for agents, that will build their confidence. But naturally there is a lot of unsettle around actually contact centers aren't going to exist in 5 years. I've read that quite a lot, and I don't actually personally think we're quite there with that. I think it's a really unrealistic headline. I think there's still a whole batch of stuff that needs to be done around how the customers feel about it, because I do think that there will be a point where customers will indicate that actually they'd rather be talking to a human being.
The interesting thing for me, particularly in that context, is that if you're at a point as a customer, and again, I'm sure you've been here as well, as a customer, when you're going through any kind of customer journey and it has those AI elements or the self-serve elements, when you get to the point where you need to speak to a person, not only do I need to speak to a person, I need to speak to someone who is an expert at what they're doing. Because I'm sorry, I've tried turning it off and on again. I've actually done factory resets on the device. I'm thinking about it for like fixing my internet as an example, which I had to do recently. I've tried turning it off and on again. I've tried resetting it to factory settings. I've tried doing this. I've Googled all of the alert lights. I've done the self-serve piece. And when I finally get through to someone, the last thing I want to hear is, yeah, can you try turning it off and on again? I've done that. Well, I need you to do that again for me so I can tick my box because I'm following my process. Like, I am clawing my eyes out and screaming down the phone at that point. I think the key thing there is that the demand on the contact centers as self-serve comes up will be that the expectation when you do get hold of somebody is that that human element is an expert level. And I think that just feeds into this idea that it is a skill. To be a contact center agent in today's society is a skilled thing to be able to do. It's not just, mindlessly pressing buttons. And I think that that's one of the elements that I think is going to come forward. And just to piggyback on that, and I'm talking a lot here, I get passionate here, sorry, but the other piece of that is that because we're taking a lot of the self-serve interactions away, again, another silly example, I call it to make a payment. I don't want to talk to a human to do that. I just want to be able to do that. Take all of those short, simple, straightforward interactions out of the equation, and all of a sudden things like your average handle time goes up, your the hold time goes up because they need to interrogate the data more. And so actually your KPIs may start to shift to accommodate for these increases in complexity. I realize that was just more a comment rather than a question, but what say you?
Yeah, I would agree. There's a lot of uncharted stuff that we're not aware of, and we need to see it in practice. Like a lot of the stuff that I've seen modeled has been in really specific environments around specific natures. I've got a really fortunate position. I've worked in contact centers ranging from cruise companies through to finance and insurance, and I can tell you wholeheartedly the calls are very different. The information is very, very different, and I see a lot of challenge with that.
Very much so. Unfortunately, it's my final question before we run out of time. One final question for you. What's one piece of advice you'd give to leaders who want to build a thriving team culture where engagement is high and keeps pace with that ever-changing work environment, whether that's through automation, whether that's through self-serve, whether that's through remote hybrid working, navigating that change?
I think it comes down to saying that I've been told by a previous director that I had, catch them doing it right. Always catch them doing it right. You shouldn't be catching people doing stuff wrong. You should be catching people doing stuff right. And that feeds into everything.
What a great phrase. I love that. Catch people doing things right. That's
Really
very
stuck
cool.
with me. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I absolutely love that. Amazing. So Dave Clowes, that brings us to the end of our conversation. Thank you ever so much for spending time talking to me today. And I do hope to speak to you again in the future.
No problem at all. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.